Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Carruth Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 2010 war thriller titled Green Zone. Now, Green Zone was directed by Paul Greengrass, and if memory serves me correctly, this is actually the third collaboration that Paul Greengrass and Matt Damon had been involved in. Of course, the Bourne Supremacy and the Bourne Ultimatum was the other two movies that had Matt Damon in it, starring in it. And so I guess this is the third collaboration between Matt Damon and Paul Greengrass. I'm not sure. Of course, Paul Greengrass is also noted for directing the 2006 movie United 93, which is a really, really good movie. I would recommend a person to see that one. The production team consisted of Tim Bevan, Eric Fellner, Lloyd Levin, and once again Paul Greengrass. And this movie was based upon the novel called The Imperial Life in the Emerald City by Washington Post Iraq correspondent Rajiv Chandrasekaran. I hope I pronounced his name right. If I butchered your name, I completely apologize. All right. The score was done by John Powell. The cinematography was done by let's see, Barry Ackroyd, and the editing was done by Christopher Rouse. And the stars of the movie are Matt Damon, Greg Kinnear, Brendan Gleeson, Amy Ryan, Khalid Abdalla, Jason Isaacs, and Yigal Naor. So this movie kind of like takes us back to the year 2003 during the early days of the war on Iraq. This is during the time when President George W. Bush sent soldiers out to Iraq. This was during the time when I believe Iraqi President Saddam Hussein's power was coming to a close. So they sent the troops in because George W. Bush believed that in Saddam Hussein's estate or somewhere within his premises, he is hiding weapons of mass destruction, or as I will say through this broadcast, as WMDs. So this was during the time of the early Iraq invasion. Speculators believed that this dangerous mission was a necessity as the military must finally terminate all of the weapons of mass destructions that was once in the hands of Saddam Hussein. In 2010, it was discovered that Hussein wasn't actually hiding any weapons of mass destruction, and the mission unfortunately came out empty. It's unknown if the information that got to them was misconstrued, a failure, or a lack of competence. The speculation was definitely at an all time high. In Paul Greengrass's Green Zone, this gripping thriller emulates from Baghdad, Iraq, which takes us back in the early days of a coalition invasion where the search for WMDs goes underway. Based on the Washington Post Baghdad correspondent Rajiv Chandrasekaran's novel Imperial Life in the Emerald City, and under the penmanship of screenwriter Brian Helgeland, we have a brilliant fictional story with scenes that may ring some realism behind it. Many people may have thought that this movie had a lot of inaccuracies, but I want to tell you something. This is not based off of everything that Rajiv wrote. Many people were upset about that. But you must have to realize this was not off of his novel. This was just a recreation and made it into a movie. If you really want to know, the more penmanship behind this movie comes from Helgeland, not Rajiv's novel. This was just a recreation of the possibilities of what would happen if you send your allies out to a foreign country to look for weapons of mass destruction. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of this is true. This is a fictionalization. Yes, it is actually inspired by real characters, which I will get to. But I want to tell you something. There's nothing real about this movie. It's just a story. And it was good. It had a lot of thought provoking things. If you were expecting to see, an all out war fest, we have that. There is tons of violence in this movie, but it's not just a war movie. This one actually has some political, thought provoking scenes that makes us question our humanity and what lengths we go through. Sure, there might be some occasional stereotypical cliches that you would see in this movie, but it's still handled quite well. So the story goes a little bit something like this. We have U.S. military chief warrant officer Roy Miller, played by Matt Damon. He is a determined man going into more liberated Iraq in search for these weapons of mass destruction, he and his allies. His frustrations worsens due to every location he searches only to come out empty. And then we have Greg Kinnear, who plays the role of Bush administrator, works at the Pentagon. His name is Clark Poundstone. He believes that the weapons of mass destruction intelligence does exist, and the source of information he is getting from is an incognito informant who goes by the name of Magellan. Meanwhile, CIA operative Martin Brown, played by Brendan Gleeson, contradicts that there is no WMD and secretly informs Miller about it. An Iraqi by the name of Freddy, played by Khalid Abdalla, reports to Miller that a Republican guard named Al-Rawi, played by Yigal Naor, is on the scene. Both Brown and Poundstone want Al-Rawi captured for contrasting reasons. Al-Rawi may probably have the answers if there really is or if there is not weapons of mass destruction. But of course, his mission to find this guy is a lot more complex. I mean, I may be simplifying this movie, but it's a lot harder than one can think. This is really, really a mind-boggling thinking person's movie. This is not just some stupid war action film. This has a lot of insightful, intelligent situations. This movie kind of juxtaposes between a shoot-'em-up war film combined with a lot of political conflicts that goes along with it. Am I saying that this movie was Oscar worthy? Probably not. But it is still really handled well. So as Miller's investigation gets deeper, he finds himself in an uncompromising position by being tracked down by fellow soldiers. Although lots of the scenes are based off of Rajiv's book, it is not a recreation of it. Its purpose is just a backdrop of the scenes, but Green Zone is a completely different story. Like I said, most of this stuff is dependent upon Brian Helgeland's script. And while Rajiv freely gives accurate names and leaves nothing behind, Greengrass and Helgeland spruce up their movie by using fake names and identities, probably maybe for fear of retribution. Or maybe because they just didn't have the license to use the real person's names or identities. Kind of like in the old 1926 movie Nosferatu. They couldn't really quite use the Dracula name because Bram Stoker's surviving wife at the time, she didn't want. They didn't want the Dracula name to come into effect, so they changed it to Nosferatu. It's sort of something similar like that. They just didn't want to use the real names, just to keep it low profile, or maybe because they just didn't want it to be based off of Rajiv's novel, so they just used fake names. But we could tell that these fake names is actually inspired by real people. Like, for example, Roy Miller is based off of Richard Monty Gonzalez. Clark Poundstone is U.S. Defensive Secretary, I think his name was Paul Bremer. And we have Wall Street journalist, reporter Laurie Dane, played by Amy Ryan. She is actually based off of New York Times journalist Judith Miller, who was also on the scenes trying to get the latest story. And she's also being kind of maybe either misinformed. So there is a lot of conflict that goes on in this movie, not just necessarily in the wars torn Iraq, but also within Washington, D.C., since the main rivalries here seem to stem from CIA representative Martin Brown and Pentagon representative Clark Poundstone. So during this almost 2-hour duration, Greengrass lets the thrill ride take off, and the intensity and the energy never deters. Now, many people had also complained that there was a lot of shaky cam in this, just like in the Bourne movies. And, I am, now, granted, I am not a huge fan of shaky cam. I find it annoying. But I think here this one actually does work to some effect. When you're in a rush and when you're fighting off Iraqi soldiers and you're looking for weapons of mass destruction, going on a wild goose chase, I guess to some extent the shaky cam thing actually does work much more effectively. At least it doesn't detract stuff like you would see in the Michael Bay Transformers movies or a lot of modern day action movies which seem to like to use the old archaic handheld cameras and everything seems to shake. But this one here, I have to admit, it works to great effect. In a nutshell, this is actually a pretty archaic story about an individual who's on a wild goose chase, surrounded by corruption, and who goes out of his way to unravel the truth. And yes, Miller is the protagonist, and Poundstone and his loyal band of sycophants are antagonists. There's still a plethora of gray areas that come around. So, in other words, Miller may be the protagonist, but he's not all entirely out to do good. And, even though Poundstone could come off as kind of the slimy villain, he's actually, basically still under scrutiny from the other upper echelons surrounding Washington D.C. and the other administrators, the other higher ups, including Mr. President himself. So, these guys are just doing their jobs. And that's kind of like where the whole gray area effect comes in. The handling of the camera shots during the action scenes are purely satisfying with the in your face approach. You feel that you actually are in the middle of this whole chaotic action. The movie camera and the fast editing can make this film feel like another rehash of the Bourne films Greengrass and Damon have done over the years, but the only difference is that the visual indicators have a more coherent approach to it. And I didn't feel like this was a hindrance, the whole shaky cam thing. The visuals are relatively stunning, and the score by John Powell adds the ambiance towards the scene to make everything all the more scintillating. Damon, furious, who's pretty much famous for his man on the run films like Bourne and a new recent movie coming up called The Great Wall. He was actually the right choice for the role, and never once does he feel disconnected in any way, shape, or form. He's good for these kind of movies. Though cliched, his clean cut approach is convincing, and he definitely was the right choice to play the good guy. Greg Kinnear, he kind of sort of breaks typecast here as the corrupt man whose idealism sort of eventually gets the better of him. It's actually quite refreshing to see Brendan Gleeson play a rare creature in the movie industry, a CIA operative who's actually sympathetic. I have never thought. I mean, usually a lot of these CIA people in in movies are usually just rogue, mean mean people who just have the pleasure in killing or have the pleasure in being assassins for the sake of being assassins. This guy is a CIA operative who we actually take sympathy with. And he's actually the more honest of the two. Between Poundstone and Brown, Martin Brown comes across as being rather sympathetic. I even was impressed with the role of Khalid Abdalla, who kind of played off the role as an evil hijacker in United 93, plays a more sympathetic role as a translator to Mr. Miller. Freddie was his name. And he is kind of like lost in the way as to which kind of loyalty he wants to choose. Does he want to be on the side of the Americans? After all, they're invading Iraqi territory. They're pretty much putting themselves in the middle of a war. And being that he's from Iraq and he's siding with the Americans, even though he's doing it out of reluctance, he's kind of like stuck between loyalties, choosing which side is he loyal to. But what makes Green Zone stand out is the way that it balances fact and fiction quite proportionately. And even though it seems like it plays out harshly towards the Bush administration's, it's quite the misnomer. It's definitely a fictional thriller, striving to see how far one will go to see if weapons of mass destruction truly exist. So if you're both a fan of political thrillers and fast paced action films, I think you are all in for a real treat. So, with that in mind, if I was to give this score out of 10, I would give Green Zone a 9. So, I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. Just remember, be kind, be courteous, and please don't be rude. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Kurt Ryder saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.